Good afternoon, good evening, good morning for all the time zones represented here. My name is Wyatt, Senior Director of Morrison Planetarium and Science Visualization at the California Academy of Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to host this panel on visual storytelling. I think any science communicator and really any communicator will talk about the importance of story in what we do. And of course, I think in this group, probably don't have to make much of an argument in favor of visualization and the power of taking data and delivering it in a way that is authentic and meaningful to our audiences. So what I was really interested in exploring today was this question of sort of how these intersect, the intersection of story and visualization, and how they kind of play off of each other and affect each other. And so I'm really delighted to have three amazing panelists here to help us explore this issue. I'm going to have each of them introduce themselves. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation, and then we're hoping we'll have enough time for a few questions from you participating today as well. So I'm just going to one by one kind of hand this off to each of our participants, and we'll start with Kalina to talk about your work.
Thank you, Ryan. Could I please screen share? Yes, excellent. So I'm Kalina Borkiewicz. I'm pulling up my slides. I wear several hats, but the most relevant hat that I'm wearing for this talk is I lead a group called the Advanced Visualization Lab, which is at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Another perhaps relevant hat is I'm very involved with the ACM SIGGRAPH conference. Most recently, I chaired the Academy Award Qualifying Computer Animation Festival as part of that. So in addition to being in visualization, I'm also very steeped in the wider computer graphics and film industry. So the AVL team that I lead has really pioneered this term and concept of cinematic scientific visualization. I'm trying to get the acronym CSV to catch on, so start using it, trying to make it a thing. Here's an example of a cinematic visualization compared to a more analytical visualization that we've created. So our team puts a lot of effort on the design of this work, lighting, shading, cinematography, data interpolation, artifact removal, to a much larger extent than you would for other types of visualization. So design, storytelling, and overall audience experience are things that we prioritize. Our goal is not just to inform our audience, but also to inspire and to entertain by showing real scientific data that's validated by domain experts. So we often create these cinematic visualizations for IMAX films, dome shows, documentaries, television, streaming services, etc. Here's a sampling of some of the movies that we've contributed to. And to end my introduction, I'll play a brief demo reel that shows some of the team's work.
Amazing work. Thank you, Kalina. And next up, I'd like to ask Brian to talk to us a little bit about his work.
Hi, my name is Brian Tatosky. I am a visual effects supervisor for CBS Studios, where I work on the Star Trek shows. including the 3rd season of Star Trek Picard, the latest season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, season 2 and 3, and season 5 of Star Trek Discovery, which is the finals the show. And basically, a lot of what I do is interpreting the scripts and turning them into the effects of the show, but also, we do pay attention to the science and the things that are out there so that we can pitch ideas and pitch looks and concepts and stuff that, at least at the beginning, as far as we can get, to be close to actual science. And I can show you a couple of moving images of the type of stuff that we do. This is footage from season 5 of a no doubt entirely scientifically accurate alien attacking our crew of the Discovery on a planet that you will learn what it is later, so that I don't break any NDAs. So we show, basically we put in all the spaceships and all the creatures and all the planets and things. I'll show some other stuff really quick. Strange New Worlds, again, incredibly scientifically accurate, as you can all see and notice right off the top of your heads. Clouds in space. Aliens, whether practical or completely CG, terrorizing the crew of the Enterprise, and lots of things like that.
Very good. Thanks. Well, I'm excited to see where we go with our conversation. And lastly, I'd like to ask Jen to describe a little bit of her work.
Sure, I'm going to share my screen here just for a moment. I'm Jen Christiansen. I'm a senior graphics editor at Scientific American magazine. I started there in '96. I was there for a few years, moved on to National Geographic, freelanced as a science communicator for a bit, and then returned to Scientific American in 2007. I art direct data visualizations like this example by Shirley Wu, and explanatory diagrams like this example by Sherry Sinnen, and everything in between, like this example by Nick Brockelman, which kind of has some data viz elements and some schematics or explanatory diagram elements. At the magazine, I have to deal with the tension between different kinds of storytelling quite a lot. I love this piece from Matteo Farinella that kind of gets across the idea of expository versus narrative. We're kind of constantly trying to figure out how visualizations should serve our larger story, and whether or not they should be more expository in nature, or if they should actually kind of help convey the narrative of the story itself. Just some examples from the magazine in 1976. There's a piece on the left here that shows cosmic expansion. This is a little bit more kind of true to the data. On the right is a much more recent version by Don Dixon that kind of gets rid of that quantitative element, and starts to add things that make it feel a little bit more in the service of a narrative story, because you can start to kind of imagine yourself on one of these galaxies in an expanding universe. So there's pieces like this from Nadi Bremer, but also I'm using visualizations quite a lot as kind of connective tissue to help walk somebody through the story being told in the text. And this actually we've been doing a lot more often lately, because everything we do also has to be legible on a mobile phone. Here's a slightly closer look at that. And then sometimes we just dive in all the way and just really kind of embrace storytelling forms in the form of comics and whatnot, and actually have the data be illustrated in a more kind of a less kind of perhaps accurate way, but perhaps a way that can engage somebody into a story. I have a little bit more on storytelling in my book, Building Science Graphics, which I'm also happy to talk about later as well. I think that's it from me.
Great. Thank you. And thanks each of you for agreeing to spend some time with us to talk about this today. I'm really just loving the diversity of perspectives that each of you brings to this topic. And if I could just start things off, Kalina, I mean, with your experience working with writers and directors to shape a story, I'm curious how maybe you could share examples of how visualization maybe could have started out trying to tell one story and maybe ended up telling a different story, or if there's just examples of how like that interaction between the narrative of a planetarium show or film kind of evolved to work better with a visualization.
Yeah, that's always a back and forth. So typically when we're working on a film, we do start out with a very rough, high level idea of a script, and we'll know like, here we want to show the galaxy. So then, we'll actually get a data set of said galaxy and then, start working with it, see what it looks like. And there's usually surprises. And, it might end up that the script ends up going in a different direction because we thought we'd see something, but we see something else, or just what we thought was interesting is not as interesting as this other thing that we find. So depending on how that goes and what we find in the visualization, there's always open dialogue with the director, script writer. So we'll kind of go back and say, well, here's what we found, here's a draft visualization, and iterate on the script. And it usually goes through many changes and has quite significant differences from what we started out thinking we would do from the story at the end, because the visualization really does inform the script. It's not, we don't, force the data to show what we wanted the script to say in the story. It goes both ways and there's back and forth.
Well, then I'm curious, Brian, with your experience where the story may be more predetermined, I guess I often talk to people who work in film and are greatly inspired by the science. I talk to scientists who are greatly inspired by science fiction. I'm kind of curious, like, are there cases where a writer or director is coming in like they want to include a specific kind of science idea with whatever level of accuracy makes sense? Or are there times when you've had the opportunity to sort of like influence a more scientifically accurate representation of something, even if it didn't start out that way?
Well, I mean, our writers run the gamut. We have some that are very interested in starting with a scientific concept that they've heard about and expanding on that. I mean, that's how we got into some of the mycelial network things that are happening with Discovery, kind of extrapolating onto things from things that we know about and then going way far afield from there. And, our executive producers are always in touch with Erin McDonald, who is our science advisor, and, asking her literal questions about what would this actually look like? What would this actually do? But then sort of the reverse of what Kalina has is that we fit the data to match our story, for better or worse, where it gets massaged into essentially sort of what the most dramatic look is for a thing. What's the, we're always about intensifying the drama in the story with our effects. So we're kind of doing the reverse and taking something that started off, and you'll see some things in season 5 that I can't talk about yet that definitely started inspired by exact concepts and exact looks of things that we found and we presented to the writers and said, maybe this could look like this because we've never seen this before in the show. Because the art department is always looking at scientific visualization, effects department we're always looking at scientific stuff, motion graphics, to try to start from a real place and then expand out from there. So we're always looking at the real pictures for inspiration. We have to do tons of nebulas, and what we joke about is space holes. There's always some portal to somewhere else. So we're always looking at what is the latest visualization of nebulas, what is the latest visualization of galaxies that's coming from James West, and putting those pictures out there and saying, hey, what do you like about this? Hey, what do you like about this? Can we incorporate some of this look, some of this feel, and moving on from there?
I think it's interesting because that iterative aspect of the process, I think, comes out in a lot of the work we've talked about so far. And actually, I thought it was interesting, Jen, that you kind of specifically referenced this sort of the contrast between, or the maybe continuum between expository and narrative. And I'm kind of curious, are there examples of things that maybe started out one way and then became something else? Or Like, what does that process look like? Or maybe there's an example you might want to share.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I haven't thought about one that has shifted from expository to narrative, but we're often telling the story of kind of the science, from the scientists themselves. They're often our authors, and so they're telling the story of how they came upon this, this not discovery or eureka moment, but how, kind of the path of a particular field. And so we're often kind of breaking down their process. So it kind of allows us to play somewhere, in between those two things, because we're doing very kind of expository steps along the way, but the way that we're threading them together, it's kind of helping to tell how the scientists went from A to B, and also sliding in what a reader who might not be familiar with that content kind of needs to know in order to understand what was so exciting about the difference between A and B. So I think we're playing with expository in that kind of narrative arc all of the time. It's like, what does somebody need to know, and how can we give that information to them in a way that doesn't feel like they're reading a textbook, but it's just sort of like a little assist to kind of help them move so that they can continue reading that narrative and sort of remain engaged with it.
That's interesting. And actually, that's kind of interesting too, to think about your narrative as being driven like by the process and the story of the science, the way the science kind of plays out. Because often, like I think in planetarium shows, what we do is we create like we really are creating a narrative from whole cloth that often isn't very process driven in terms of like what the work is that went into a discovery, but more sort of a narrative that is structured around helping people understand like a collection of concepts. I don't know if that sounds right to you, Kalina, or.
Yeah, it sounds similar. I was thinking about that too as you were talking, Jen. For us, we don't usually tell the story of the scientist, and we've actually made the distinction between like the science narrative versus the outreach narrative, and they're often not the same thing. So we'll usually start with like an idea for a script for a larger movie, and then we'll seek out data sets that kind of would be representative of, the part of the film that we're trying to tell. And the thing that scientist might be focusing on, well, I'll give a specific example. So there is a recent data set of a star being shredded by a black hole that we visualized. And the scientist was really interested in exploring kind of the different elements that were kind of coming out as the star was being shredded, and, analyzing those differences. We looked at those and they weren't very interesting, and we just decided to visualize the density, which is kind of boring from the scientist perspective. But it kind of, the story we were trying to tell is not, it's this very complex analytical story of like, here's what is most cutting edge that the scientist is trying to study right now, but rather like, isn't it cool that a black hole could shred a star like this? Very high level, as part of a larger story about something different. This was kind of even a secondary data set to the larger story. So kind of the outreach narrative versus the science narrative sometimes are misaligned.
Yeah. It's very interesting. And actually, Brian, you mentioned inspiration of from like JWST images and things like that. Kind of where else do you seek inspiration? How do you like, I'm guessing there may be people on this call that whose work you may have mined.
I mean, I would be remiss if it didn't mention my good friend Robert Hurt, who I've known since the 80s at UCLA at the Science Fiction and Fantasy Club Enigma, who does some of that outreach and visualizations. We look everywhere, especially as a show and sort of a franchise has been going on for long enough. Like I said, we do a lot of space holes. We do a lot of nebulas. We need to make stuff look different. We need to make stuff look fresh and still be interesting to the viewer. So part of that is seeking out the new science and seeking out, the newest pictures of things, seeking out, a perfect example from season 3 of Star Trek Picard from our motion graphics department. They had to do some visualizations of things that were happening inside of Data and Picard's brain, and the motion graphics guy reached out to some guys that were doing some neurology studies and talking to them about how to visualize the things that were happening in the brain, so he could build a 3D brain model and have the the fantastic, not realistic stuff, at least start from a basis of realism and start
Yeah.
from a basis of how they would actually visualize a thing. You know, so that's what we're doing. We're always jumping off there, but we're always looking for the interesting thing. You know, something that we mentioned earlier when we had our pre-talk about this is, we need a dramatic sun when we're going by a star. You know, obviously the ones that we're going by are not photoreal in as far as the visual light spectrum, but the X-ray version of a sun looks cool and it helps tell the story of drama and activity and things happening on the sun. So as we get closer to a star or closer to the sun itself, like we did in season 2, we're using like more of the X-ray version where you can see the sunspots and see more activity and stuff, and it makes it more dramatic and scary instead of just, super bright as it would be if you're using the visual spectrum. So, we're tweaking that information as it comes out. And I love the idea of, a planet being eaten by a black hole with new visualizations on it. And I can't wait to see what that looks like, so that someday we'll be doing something where we're going to need that. And we're going to start from that realistic. We're going to start from that realistic data. And that's what we're going to put in front of them first and say, here's what it really looks like. Where do we go from there? And, where do you want to see it go from there?
Cool. Well, and actually, Jen, when you mentioned that while we think of many of us probably think of Scientific American as this beautiful print publication, as you pointed out, you're moving toward having to sort of make multi-purpose applications for the visuals that you use, and we did kind of touch on this as Brian mentioned, we kind of talked a little earlier to prepare for this, that's kind of pushing you in more of a sort of linear storytelling, or more like the film-like approach to narratives. I'm curious if you had any thoughts to share on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my heart kind of lies originally in, spread graphics, where composition and size and it kind of really guide the reader's eye through it. But someone can just spend time with it and kind of make connections on their own with a little bit of guidance and that sort of thing. But as we need to reformat everything to be read in so many different ways, it's really kind of forced us into really being very clear on what the reader needs to see first, second, third. And that really does, I feel like, fall into much more with what you all are doing with video, in which, there's somebody can maybe rewind it, but you can't just scan and kind of start to make connections on your own. So you have to be very intentional on what information is coming first, second, and third. And so that's been challenging to also then still produce a print page that feels lush and exciting to stay with. But it definitely has been kind of forming how we tell stories visually. Yeah.
I think it's like kind of a grass is always greener, because I always think, oh, if we only had that opportunity, because in a show it's just everything's just moving forward, you got a narrator and music and all this stuff happening, and like you've got to kind of keep everything understandable so quickly. And I've always envied print, but yeah, kind of moving in this same direction. Sorry, Brian, you were going to comment.
No, I was just going to say, I think we all have the commonality of, we've got that certain window in which to present whatever our concept is, and that window goes by very fast. So it's figuring out what's the right pictures that go with that tiny window to sell our overall, whether it's dramatic story or information,
Well, I'm hoping we have some time to take some questions from participants, but actually I'd just like to ask the panelists, is there anything you'd like to ask each other before we do that? I'm springing this on you. I didn't mention this earlier, but just in case there's any conversation that I've stopped with my hammering of questions.
I have one for Kalina, because I know when you're doing these visualizations of things, I'm interested in you talking more about that process of finding the right way to present that information to show the overall story. Because I think that that's really fascinating, because again, there's a million ways to present a set of data. How do you skin that cat for when you need to get it to an audience and sell them on a thing or instruct them on a thing? Just to go into more detail about that.
Sure. So there's a lot of back and forth in the process between the script and then even within our visualization team. The people in the AVL are what we call a Renaissance team. So we have artists and designers working together with programmers and technologists. And then we work with external science teams. And usually when we get a data set, it starts with the programmers in the team who kind of figure out how to wrangle the data and get it, into something usable. And then we'll often start with kind of a first look, like a quick and dirty visualization of like, okay, what does this generally look like? We use a tool called Party View developed by Stuart Levy, who's on this call. It's an open source tool that we use for pre-visualization. So we kind of downsample the data because usually these are very large data sets. We're at a supercomputing center. So we downsample it so that we can get it just, playing in real time. And just kind of take a look at it and then say like, oh, wow, here's some interesting things that we found in it. Oh, we'll definitely need to slow this down, or like we need to fix this artifact, kind of just figure out some initial things about the data. And, often find lots of surprises. But after the technical stuff is sorted out just in terms of being able to even get it working in our tools, the data goes toward designers. And then there's kind of a lot of challenges there in terms of, well, what parts of the data do we show? There might be a dozen different data variables, density, temperature, metallicity, lots of things. What do each of those look like? Sometimes we don't visualize all of them, but just maybe a sampling of them, or go to the scientist and say, hey, what's interesting? Like what, in your perspective, is the thing to show in this data, or where should we look? As I said in my previous example, we don't always look at those things specifically, but it's a place to start. So there's a lot of data exploration just kind of at the start of the project. Oftentimes the designers will start to get an idea of how we want to show the visualization and tell the story. And then throw it back to the programmers on the team and say like, hey, this is kind of missing this piece of the story. Can we grab another data set from somewhere else to kind of fill in this context? Because usually a data set focuses on one really small specific piece of a larger story. And when we're trying to tell that larger story, it requires bringing multiple data sets together, or kind of creating derivative data sometimes to highlight or pull out certain aspects. So kind of throw it back to the programmers to sort that out. Programmers throw it back to the designers to figure out how to make that work. And it goes back and forth for a few months until we get something that we're happy with. And throughout that process, we also send drafts to the scientists. Sometimes we found out that something we thought was like an interesting feature was just like a mistake that we made in the processing and made it look like something that wasn't really there, or whatnot. So just kind of throwing things back and forth between the scientists, programmers, and designers in the team until we get to something that we're happy with.
Yeah, iteration. When we had our meeting last week, we said this time was going to go by insanely quickly. It has. I do want to ask Robert if we have any questions from the chat. We didn't explicitly ask for those, but if we have any, Robert, maybe you can let us know.
Yeah, we actually have a couple, and let me just jump in and invite Jack Madden actually had posted a fairly lengthy question. So if you just want to unmute and ask your question.
Sure, I can do that. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This was interesting. So I've kind of a question for Jen and Kalina. Jen, you used the term engagement to describe like the reason to take some creative freedoms with real data or theory. So do you guys ever worry about like how those creative freedoms provide a false sense of understanding when you're presenting these topics from like an educational authority to audiences who can't really discern the boundaries between those? And instead of prioritizing engagement, do you ever highlight how little we understand or how fluid our knowledge is?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's definitely a tension there. We use opening illustrations, which tend to be less necessarily accurate as a way to engage readers for sure, then lean on the graphics more to kind of really get into we're going to label this out and explain it further. That said, the scientists we collaborate with are very often frustrated that we're removing jargon and using less like visual jargon and word jargon and using less specific terms and visuals. But if we relied on the really specific ones that our readers don't have the language, either the visual or the written language to understand, then it's not doing anyone any favors. So there's definitely a tension there. We try to nod to the ambiguities and the uncertainties visually, using different visualization forms to help suggest that there's uncertainty involved, and with words to kind of describe often or mostly, to help kind of counter this idea that this particular thing doesn't always happen, or not necessarily exactly like this. And then we also fall into the world of metaphor and start to do more abstracted visuals, less photoreal, kind of apparent, like photoreal with the cosmic world is like, that's a whole other thing. But we try to make, if we're trying to explain something that is very uncertain, we'll try to maybe strip it down to abstract shapes as opposed to trying to put it in a star field so that it feels more real to people.
For the AVL, this is a topic that I'm personally very interested in, especially when we're creating visualizations that appear photorealistic or can be interpreted as photorealistic, even if they're not really, and they're, very beautiful. Our audiences can sometimes be confused as to whether what they're looking at is a data visualization or just an made up artistic illustration, or something captured with like a telescope, like real video photography. It's a toss-up, could be any of those three if you were to just, look at one of our visualizations, photorealistic ones without context. So something that we've started doing once we kind of became more aware of this issue is audience research. We had a recent grant that we showed draft visualizations and then kind of finals to audiences to test the impact of things like annotations and just different design decisions on whether audiences are understanding what they're looking at. Throwing in things that aren't necessarily photorealistic, like streamlines or labels, is likely to help. We just did some research, a larger project on the use of annotations. So we haven't really answered these questions yet, but this is a problem that we're aware of and a very interesting research area that we're starting to dabble in.
Thank great answers, and we got so many good questions, and we're running tight on time. So let me just ask for Jeff Nee. Have an interesting question on: were there any examples of life being stranger than fiction, of a visualization that was maybe data-based that you see and you think, good grief, I could have never even imagined that would be real? That was something that's more believed to be in Star Trek, but actually was in the real world.
Any quantum article I ever work on. Just, yeah.
I mean, I'll say we did a core collapse supernova in our recent show, and having learned in astronomy textbooks about like onion skins and things like that, and layers and nice even like circles drawn around things, seeing the reality of the visualization of the simulation was like mind-blowing, because it's not that, it's totally chaotic and it's insane.
Yeah, I mean, at least for my part, I don't know about things that probably couldn't make it up, but I'm always looking at new stuff, and just seeing a really good visualization of a scientific process is sometimes so beautiful, and it's almost transcendent in its own little way of just seeing the beauty of like mathematics and science working, that I'm just always in awe of, just finding out the way things actually work. I mean, it's so impressive to me, and so much I feel like if I could really capture just how cool that thing actually is on a show, that would be absolutely amazing.
Well, that seems like a great thought on which to end our panel discussion. I want to thank Kalina, Brian, and Jen for taking the time. The sad thing about Zoom is that applause doesn't work, but thank you very, very much for your time. So happy to have had this conversation, and I look forward to carrying it on in the future in different settings. But for now, I'll turn things over to Robert for our lightning talks.
Oops. There we go. Unmuting and switching back to the normal view here. I will say there's actually a really great conversation evolving in the chat, and I encourage people to keep adding to that. We'll try to capture that at the end here. But thank you. Oh, that was just wonderful. But let us switch over, and we have two contributions today. I'm going to start actually with Alexander Bock, who's in the latest time of the night. So let's get the person who's about ready to go to bed and give him the floor first for a talk on OpenSpace, visualizing the universe in open source.
All right.
And just quickly, let me remind people, turn off your cameras and mute, but we can come back with cameras on for Q&A.
All right, let me just get started here. Great. Hope this works for everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Bock. I'm an assistant professor in immersive visualization at Linköping University, and also the lead developer and software architect for a software called OpenSpace that I'm really happy to talk to you about for the next 5 minutes or so. So here you can already see one of the images that we've generated with OpenSpace. It's an open source astronomical visualization tool where we can basically fly around the entire universe and look at data visualization from all kinds of different sites. So if we start looking at a couple of the other examples of data sets that we have in our software. So here we're looking at the southwestern Kandor Chasma as imaged by the HiRISE instrument on board the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. So we're able to fly down, and there we have stereoscopic reconstruction of the height field, so we can look at all of the surface features. And in here we're looking at hills that are on the order of about 50 meters or so. So we can actually look down on the human scale and actually like transcend and like transport people onto the actual planetary surfaces and give them the opportunity to discover all of those alien vistas that probably 99.999% of us will never be able to see in person. Looking at, and this goes back to, I think, Jeff's question earlier, the things that I could have never came up with on my own. Like here, we're looking at the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, galaxies in all directions, except none up and down, which is exactly where the plane of our Milky Way lies. So we can't actually observe through that dense structure of gas and stars. So there's like this zone of exclusion that we can't see. And within interactive software, you can fly around and actually discover that for yourself and see the different campaigns of measurements that we have taken. And it gives you like a much better understanding for the different data sets and also the artifacts that come from it naturally. Moving on, another of the examples that anyone can now discover. This was from a session at the Hayden Planetarium in New York, where we were visualizing the 1.3 billion stars of the Gaia Data Release 2 catalog. So for, as far as I'm aware, at least, the first time in a planetarium. So you could fly around the entire catalog of stars and look at it. And there is the people at the bottom that you can see are guided by Jackie Faherty, who is an astronomer at the museum. But the software that we're developing is not only for public presentation, but it's also for use by domain experts. So in this case, the example that we're seeing here is a tool that we have very recently developed, which puts all of the data of the exoplanet archive at the experts' fingertips. So we have about 5,000 plus exoplanets that we know about. And if we combine all the different data sets together per exoplanet, we are on the order of maybe 100 or so data dimensions. So this is like a vast data set that is so far pretty much like untapped from a visualization point of view. And we have integrated some of those visualization tools and using both scientific visualization, as you can see here, but also information visualization tools like parallel coordinates plots, being able to filter planets on different categories and so forth in order to give an overview of like what's out there. But this is kind of the secret sauce, is that we can use the same software in a planetarium also for scientists, so we can get scientists into a planetarium to talk to the public about their newest discoveries. So it's kind of at the heart of it. Another example that we can see here is the JUICE spacecraft flying around a simulation of the magnetic field around Ganymede. Of course, this hasn't happened yet, so this is more like a predictive simulation of what our current best plans for that spacecraft is. And lastly, also an example of a spacecraft that has already launched and also landed. Here we're seeing Rosetta taking pictures of the little purple line that you can see here is the Philae lander just before moments of impact before it. Well, it did successfully impact, but not quite successfully land, unfortunately. So the software as a whole, we're 7 people, or no, 9 people now actually that are working on it. 6 of us are located here where I am in Sweden, and 3 of us are located over on the US side. So it's a truly multinational project that have been working on for over 10 years at this point. So it's been very, very, very exciting that this has been going on. We're targeting, I wouldn't say mainly anymore, but in the beginning, mainly planetariums. Here's like a small selection of different planetariums that are using OpenSpace in sometimes daily programming, sometimes a bit more irregular programming. But what I want to highlight is also that, as I said, it's not just planetariums, but it's everyone around the world. So here is a map of all of the people that have started OpenSpace at some point, which truly is now a global phenomenon. And in case that wasn't clear, it's all open source. It's MIT licensed, so anyone can download it for free, use it, contribute, and use it to make any kinds of visualizations. So with that, this is the mandatory funder slide. And with that, I'll open up for questions if there are any.
Alex, thank you so much for a whirlwind tour. It seems incredibly rude to ask you to condense all of OpenSpace into 5 minutes, but you did a marvelous job. Does anyone want to either just unmute and ask a question or drop something into chat?
Well, Alex, I didn't realize it'd been 10 years. Well, like, where do you imagine OpenSpace going in the next 10 years? That's one thing that I'm interested in hearing from you.
That's a very good question. I hope that in 10 years we'll be, okay, this will sound weird, but I don't mean it in a bad way. I hope that the development team will not be involved in any content development anymore. I hope that, what I mean by that is that I hope that the group of users will have, and that the tools have matured enough so that there is a good community out there that can create things for each other. Because right now it's all like fairly centered on the development team, and I hope that that's the first thing to go, actually, because that's a good way to spread the knowledge of it.
And Carl Knox has raised his hand, so let's switch to Carl, and which will be also a nice segue.
Hi, Alex. Can I ask if OpenSpace does n-body simulations and gravities? Like, so if you set off 2 3D objects, can you get them to then go into orbit if you set them an initial velocity and mass?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I had to cut out. So we are not doing any physics simulations ourselves. So we are only using Keplerian elements or spice kernels or 2-line elements, which are Keplerian. But we're taking in all of the orbital informations from other sources. So we don't do any physics propagations ourselves. So the answer is no, unfortunately.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Well,
great. With that, I might share my screen, Robert, if you're ready.
Yes, go ahead. We switch over to Carl Knox at the morning side time zones.
That's right. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you, Robert, for bringing together such a beautiful group of people that are so open to sharing their knowledge and inspiring each other. Thank you so much. My name is Carl Knox. I work at the Centre for Gravitational Wave Discovery in Melbourne, Australia, based at Swinburne University. We have 300 members. And I'm the only artist on the team. So it's my job to visually translate all the amazing research that these researchers do. I've been there for 7 years now, and I thought I'd get sick of making images of black holes, but I'm still finding ways to make new ones. Usually I work with the researchers. They give me a sketch and I do the graphics for them, or I take real data and I plot it out using various softwares. I'm here to talk about immersive interactive content. And so immediately I was drawn to virtual reality as a content creation tool. And we found it was incredibly useful for immersing one user in a beautifully rich environment. I'm aware that this video might be a bit laggy because I'm all the way in Australia. So I will post a link in the chat shortly for, you can watch it locally on YouTube. Yeah, virtual reality is wonderful. It has a certain amount of, pros and cons. One of them is that it has an incredibly strong impact. Unfortunately, it does require an expensive PC. It can be quite exhausting, isolating. People don't want to put on headsets sometimes because they're wearing makeup or have beautiful hair and things like that, we noticed. And it's just not Instagrammable. And so to kind of combat all of those things, I created a whole range of content, and I'm just going to chuck a link in the chat now if you want to throw this on YouTube and watch it locally. And I'll press play again. So all of these are touch-free, interactive, immersive experiences to educate the general public on gravitational waves. So lots of body tracking, lots of hand tracking, lots of real-time processing of video feeds. Instead of putting someone's head inside a computer in VR, what we're doing is we're taking that computer and putting it on the walls, making it immersive and interactive, just trying to simulate holograms. Lots of experiences where you become the astronomical object. Like in this case, you're a black hole, and as you move through the space, you suck stars towards you and you create accretion disks. Again, they're all touch-free using things that are fairly old technology now, like Kinect sensors, VR headsets, those sorts of things. So where are we going with this in the future? We've recently received $800,000, which isn't a lot of money, to create a digital room at the university, where we're planning on having all sorts of departments at the university contributing to this space, including virtual production, experimental art, games production, and us being the astrophysics department, we love outreach, so we'll be taking our audiences through there to create all that sort of content. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to wrap it up there. If you would like to follow me or email me, please do so. And all my stuff is on Instagram if you want to have a look at all the experimental astrophysics-based works, as well as non-astrophysics-based. I don't do a lot of experimental artworks, music festivals, murals, brand things. Yeah, that's it for me. Any questions?
Carl, thank you so much. And I can also say with authority that it is incredibly cruel to have you condense all the incredible work you've been doing into 5 minutes, because I've seen you talk for much longer and still not scratch the surface. Just check, does anyone want to raise hand, have a question? Frank, you have a question. Jump, you can pop on your camera.
Okay, so Carl, I love it. I was in Seoul, South Korea, and there was an interactive art exhibit where you ran around the room and things deformed in this mesh and all this sort of stuff. And my wife just loved it. She was running around the room for like 20 minutes, it seemed like. But so much to take that and turn that into you are a black hole and actually do the scientific aspect of that. Do you have this in museums where people can run around for 20 minutes?
We currently do, yes. So just last week, I installed 2 of these at the Bendigo Discovery Science Center. So Osgrav donated my time and some hardware, and we actually upcycled a lot of their old projectors and rigging and stuff. So we saved a lot of computers from going to landfill by upcycling them for them. So it was wonderful.
What a great use for old hardware. And it's great that you can actually do these developments that do not require the latest and greatest graphics card, which of course is typically what you need to make a VR experience.
Yeah, some of them just run off a simple webcam where you get sucked, your head gets sucked into a black hole using fairly low-end hardware. So, yeah.
Any final questions for Carl from the audience? Well, I think everyone is just wowed, so let me thank you again for a fantastic presentation, and thank Ryan and all of our presenters today. I think everyone brought just incredible things to the table, and I look forward to seeing conversations that continue from all these topics. And with that note, I will end the recording.